Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I think it's very important what's going on and to pay attention what's going on in Hong Kong. It's my custom when talking about this subject to make the comment, you can't make this up. All the things that they've been doing in Hong Kong, I couldn't write it in a novel. I don't know if I'm clever enough. I think one of the things that's very important here is the PRC, that this may represent a PRC template for overcoming liberal constitutional systems anywhere when they try to exercise influence in governance. I think there are three key points that are worth making about the PRC's approach. One is that Chinese leaders are profoundly distrustful of liberal constitutional order. They've even made rules that professors can't teach it. And a second thing is that the CCP concept of national security is a whole society concept. National security risk, in their view, exists in almost any kind of behavior. And finally, that China is importing this concept to Hong Kong. And it is trying, by doing so, to replace the liberal constitutional order. Heard yesterday, and one of the speakers mentioned that basically the basic law is done, and the national security law has become the basic law of Hong Kong. So this is really important. And I think it's important to remember that the basic law itself is a liberal constitutional document. There's no way of interpreting it otherwise. Now China wants to say, no, you guys all misunderstood it. But you can't read it any other way. Promises a high degree of autonomy, maintenance of the common law, that human rights and basic freedoms, including the ICCPR, will be maintained, that the courts are independent and final. And these last two things are really important, that mainland laws would not apply in Hong Kong, except a limited number outside the scope of autonomy that might be introduced to Annex 3 of the Basic Law. And two, that mainland officials would not interfere in local operations. Two major weaknesses in the Basic Law. One was that Beijing has absolute control over its interpretation, and it's used that to introduce a lot to Hong Kong. And the second is Beijing's foot dragging over democratic reform. So these things I think are important to know. If we look at the NSL, we can see that in fact what's happened is all these commitments have been abandoned. The national security law was jammed down the throats of Hong Kong. It overrides local laws. It overrides the Basic Law. It gives the National People's Congress Standing Committee the ultimate power of interpretation again. It selects the judges that can hear national security cases and doesn't hesitate to badger. The officials don't hesitate to badger those who don't do what Beijing wants. Those selected judges can be removed if they make any statement that violates national security. Where do judges speak? They speak in court. In other words, if you rule against us, they can be removed. A committee for safeguarding national security is created with mainland Chinese advisors. So this already violates one of those guarantees. And this committee is not subject to judicial review. It can make and implement rules not subject to challenge. It's under the supervision of the Central People's Government. Okay, and then there's an Office for Safeguarding National Security that's made up entirely of mainland public security officials. And they can remove cases, as they threatened to do in the Jimmy Lai case, if the court didn't keep him in jail and deny him bail. They threatened to remove the case to the mainland and try him there. And you can only imagine how many rights would be protected. There's heavy pressure on judges. The crimes themselves are vague and can be interpreted any way you want, and it applies worldwide. So that's a quick summary of it. We know all the arrests. Some of them have already been mentioned this morning. And in the first trial of Tong Yin Kit, this guy, youngster who ran his motorcycle into a police cordon, they did not mention human rights, even though they're charging him with incitement. You know, it's Law School 101. I'm a law professor, that if you have incitement in a national security case, there's human rights implications. And even though the national security law in Article 4 says that human rights still apply and the ICCPR applies, the court did not even mention this. We have to remember it's not just criminal prosecutions. The national security law, and I outlined this in my written testimony, provides for the schools to be regulated, the media to be regulated, the bar and the law society have been put under enormous pressures, and press freedom is under attack, okay? And this was not enough. Let's make it hard for any opposition to speak. Well, let's make sure they don't take up electoral office. So they amended the basic law in its annexes so that now there's a 1,500-member election committee that has more power than anything else in Hong Kong. Okay, so this is really important. The way they've stacked the deck is there's no way anybody else could get in there except a pro-Beijing figure. And in fact, everyone else declined to run because you were going to be vetted. They set up a vetting committee to vet all candidates, and they instruct the police to investigate every candidate. In fact, recently, everybody had to declare the candidacy for the Legislative Council election, they call it, coming up, and nobody from the Democratic camp signed up. Because, well, you're going to be investigated by the police and then by this small committee that's made up of Beijing stalwarts, and then by this election committee, you're not going to clear it. And in fact, so far when they had oath-taking, they've weaponized oath-taking. You know, everyone since in Congress takes an oath, but you don't expect it to be used as a weapon against you to silence or to deny you office because of something you may have said that they don't like. It's been weaponized. So this is really important. I think when it comes to solutions, and the time is limited, so I'll quickly run through them, I think individual sanctions have not worked so well so far. And I really think, and it's harder, but I think what the U.S. needs is we should not have international business practice by companies that operate in America outside the rule of international human rights. That we should have comprehensive approaches that incorporate human rights in what businesses have to do. And it's much more difficult to push back against that because that's American law. China has its laws. It regulates what its companies can do and defends it passionately. Well, we can regulate that our companies are adherent to human rights practices. I think we need to be more multilateral on it. A group of UN experts just the other day said there should be a UN review and that this all should be looked at very carefully. And they condemn the idea that local organizations who are all now disbanding under intense pressure, that they cannot have any foreign funding. Human rights is often subject to foreign funding. And then I want to close with a kind of a personal comment. I'm a professor from Hong Kong. I spent over 30 years teaching students in Hong Kong. I have students in all sectors of the society. They're across the media. They're even were in the Apple Daily that my colleague here worked for. And I worked at two universities, the Chinese University of Hong Kong first, and then eventually the University of Hong Kong. Even this week, these universities are ordering that statues be removed that commemorate human rights violations of the past. This saddens me deeply, but what saddens me more, as a professor who teaches human rights and constitutionalism, I knew over all these years most of the people you mentioned that are in jail today. I know them personally. And the thing that's striking about them is these are the best kinds of citizens any country could want. These are good people. They're people not defending Hong Kong's rights because they make money out of it. They're defending it on principle. And many of the students I have had who are now in jail stood up for human rights, stood up for basic economic welfare of the society, and spent all these years doing that because of principles. And I can say to anybody in Beijing and Hong Kong, when you're locking up the best and brightest in your society, then you have to look in the mirror. It's not them that's wrong, it's you. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.